communication by definition is inherited. None of us created it. It's a historical, cultural phenomenon. So it's this thing that gets implanted in our mind, the language that we use. And then together with that comes a whole lot of patterning, a whole lot of assumptions, a whole lot of messages.
Welcome to the Mindful Communication Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Miller. And on today's episode, we interview Oren Jay Sofer. He teaches mindfulness, meditation, and nonviolent communication in both secular and Buddhist contexts. He is the author of the book, Say What You Mean, A Mindful Approach to Nonviolent Communication, a practical guidebook for having more effective and satisfying conversations. I loved this chat with Oren. It was such a treat to be able to talk to him because he is a long-term meditator. He'd been meditating for now over 20 years and had taken communication and brought that into his contemplative practice. This is someone who is truly dedicated to the art of mindful communication. And as we explore in this interview, the more mindful you are about your communication, the happier you're going to be, the better conversations you're going to have, and the more satisfied you're going to be with your relationships. I also love this interview because of the Buddhist context that Oren brought to this, so he drops wisdom bombs all through the interview. We start off by defining and exploring at a high level concepts around mindfulness, nonviolent communication, and somatic experiencing. These are Oren's areas of expertise, and they've helped define his philosophy on communication. Oren, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. It's nice to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you for a few reasons. When I read your book and when I started doing research about you, it seems like you kind of have these three areas of expertise that you've really kind of taken on as life skills. You have this mindfulness practice, which is a big part of your life. You have nonviolent communication, another big part of your life, and this somatic experiencing thing that's also a big part of your life. And I'd love to start off our interview by kind of touching on all three of these things. So first off, let's quickly talk about mindfulness. So, this is a pretty hot topic, very trendy. And you've been practicing mindfulness for a very long time. And I wanted for our listeners to just make sense of maybe we can make sense of what is mindfulness. There's also meditation. Are they the same thing? Can you, in your own words, describe exactly what it is?
Sure, yeah. So mindfulness is the capacity to be aware of experience in a clear and balanced way. So it's a very specific kind of knowing that's innate. All humans have the capacity to be mindful, and it means not just paying attention, but being fully and completely aware. And in this way, where there's the mind isn't biased, it's not trying to manipulate or change the experience. There's a balance in the mind. So mindfulness is this particular quality of balanced awareness that we have. And meditation is a very broad term for a whole range of techniques and practices that can be used to cultivate different qualities, mindfulness being one of them.
That's really crystal clear for me. Now, you've been practicing now for a long time, and what would you say has been the impact on your life through that practice? In a few words.
Yeah, where to begin? It changed the whole trajectory of my life. When I started meditating, I was 19 years old and working as an actor in New York City. And I gave up that whole acting career to pursue the spiritual path, to try to understand some of the deeper questions in life of what it is to be human and to be alive. So it's really kind of directed the course of my life in many, many ways, and it's brought a lot of healing to myself, to my heart, to my mind. It's allowed me to appreciate and enjoy life more, to have more balance, less reactivity, more of a sense of choice in the way that I relate to things and the things that I do. Yeah.
And you're now not just a practitioner, but you also teach teach meditation. You just actually came back from teaching a retreat, and I think before we actually initially connected, you had just sat a 30-day retreat, a 30-day silent meditation retreat, I'm assuming?
Yeah.
So how exactly do you benefit from sitting for 30 days in silence? Like, what are you getting from sitting for a whole month in silence?
A lot of different things. On one level, it's just kind of, it's often a very profound and deep reset, like of your whole nervous system. So, you think about, say, on the weekend, Saturday, usually still kind of maybe stressed out, a little bit hectic from the week. It takes a day, right? And then by Sunday, I'm a little bit more relaxed, or if you go on vacation for a week, it's this kind of similar thing. The first few days you're still unwinding, and by the time you really feel relaxed and ready to enjoy your vacation, the vacation's over. So, with a month-long retreat, you give the mind and the body and the heart a lot of space to unwind, to really slow down and come to a deeper state of rest. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is one gets to really observe more clearly both the ways in which we create stress and difficulty for ourselves through our thought patterns and habitual emotions. And then we also get to learn more about our strengths and inner resources.
And after you found this mindfulness practice in your life, when you were 19, you'd mentioned, you had been practicing this for a few years, and then it was soon after that you actually stumbled upon nonviolent communication. Is that how it happened? It was pretty soon afterwards?
It was about 5 or 6 years after I started practicing meditation, and I was living at the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and working there as a cook. And I realized that the stuff I was practicing on the cushion wasn't showing up in my conversations. So I would have arguments with my coworkers in the kitchen about really trivial things, like how long to steam the broccoli or how to cut the carrots. And all of the patience and kindness and compassion somehow seemed to magically vanish. So I recognize that there's a gap here. I need something else to help translate the meditation practice from the silent sitting into the relationships and the conversations. And so that was when I came across the work of Dr. Marshall Rosenberg and Nonviolent Communication and started practicing and studying that form as a way of bringing the values and the insights of the meditation into my life and my relationships.
So for our listeners who don't know what nonviolent communication is, could you briefly describe and give an idea what it is?
Sure. So nonviolent communication is it's a lot of different things to different people, and it really depends on how you use it. So at the most basic level, it's a way of integrating the principles of nonviolence into one's life, which includes a way of thinking, a way of viewing the world, a way of relating to oneself and others, and a way of communicating. So most people think of it as a communication technique because it has that word communication in it, but it's really much more than that. It's a whole way of being and understanding human life and relationships. And then that can be applied to interpersonal communication, mediation, conflict resolution, facilitation, diplomacy, a whole wide range of applications. So what is this way of looking at things and understanding oneself and others? There's certain fundamental principles at the heart of nonviolent communication, a few of the core ones being, number one, that all human beings share the same universal, basic, fundamental needs. That we all have certain qualities that are important to us in our life that motivate us to do things, and not just physiological needs for food and shelter and so forth, but we have relational needs for belonging, for acceptance, for friendship, for community. We have higher needs for things like meaning and purpose, contribution, transcendence, communion. So the understanding, not just in nonviolent communication, but in all of humanistic psychology, is that human beings share these basic needs, and that our actions, our behaviors are all attempts to meet these more fundamental basic needs, that we can understand human behavior as an expression of our desire for fulfillment in life. And so based on this premise, it gives us a different way to understand ourselves and others, to connect to people with whom we disagree, to see deeper than the surface views or beliefs or choices we make to what really matters underneath those things. And another fundamental view from nonviolent communication is that all humans enjoy giving and are capable of compassion, that this is also part of how we're built, that it feels good to give, to share with one another, and that when given the option, all other things being equal, a healthy human being will naturally choose the option that doesn't cause harm to other living creatures because of empathy, because we feel things. So when you put these different principles together, it provides a very different orientation to relationships and conversations, one that recognizes, listen, if we can try to understand what's actually important to both of us, it gives us a different way of understanding and connecting, such that we can access this natural capacity we have for generosity and compassion. And then we can work together to accomplish things and meet as many needs as possible. So that's kind of a big picture overview of nonviolent communication.
Yeah, I think that it's very large, and it's I think it's definitely, you mentioned right off the bat, it does, I think, throw some people off that we're talking about communication, and yet it's this really like a philosophy on how it is that we're thinking, how it is that we're, experiencing the world. One thing you did touch on was the idea of finding forgiveness for people, this natural compassionate giving that we all have. And some people might be challenged by that because maybe they're going around the world and they're seeing people acting what they would perceive as selfish. And they would question, well, is it really that natural for us to want to give to others? Isn't it very natural for us to want to make sure that we survive and reproduce as kind of our main priority? Like, how do we kind of balance between those two, I guess, priorities of ours?
Yeah. So a couple things. So the point I was trying to make was that you could say generosity is natural. Those were your words. What I was saying was that we experience joy when giving. That's a very different kind of angle. It's not saying that everyone is naturally generous, but when we give, we feel joy. That's how we're wired, is that the experience of sharing and giving freely from the heart is one that brings pleasure to the human being. I would say that human beings are naturally empathic and compassionate, that we have that capacity to feel a sensitivity and tenderness to others. That doesn't mean, though, that we always act that way or that we have access to it, because there's a lot of conditioning and a lot of habits that cover that over. Through our life experiences and the socialization process, we lose touch with the sense of natural compassion and innate empathy. And we live in a world where the whole society and the whole structure of our economy and our social institutions is such that there's no safety net, so therefore the survival mechanism gets kicked up very strongly, in which I better make sure that I'm safe, have a roof over my head, and an ability to feed myself and my family. So that instinct towards self-preservation gets exacerbated by the conditions of our society, which don't provide for the basic needs of human beings, and therefore the access to empathy and compassion gets attenuated, as well as through many experiences and messages that we get from society from a very early age about who's worthy of our compassion and love and who isn't. But that's all learned. That's not innate. If you spend time with very young children, you can see they don't differentiate between people or creatures based on all the kinds of identities and in-group and out-group categories we fixate on as we get older.
And I guess from that perspective, our hope is that because a lot of these behaviors are learned, that means that we have the opportunity to unlearn them as well, and tap into what you had mentioned, this idea that we love to give. We really enjoy that. We find joy in that giving, that natural, compassionate giving, and that hopefully we can build a society that is focused on taking care of those basic needs so that we can move past that, maybe that conditioning that we've created for ourselves.
Yeah, that's right. And, just for everyone listening out there, if you just take a few moments and reflect on the last time you helped somebody out in your life or gave somebody something, just small, doesn't need to be a big thing. And not because you had to, not because you felt obligated or that you should or it was right, but just because you wanted to. Just notice how that feels, how it feels even now to think of it or remember it. It brings some joy, it brings some delight or happiness to our heart to be able to contribute to other human beings. And so that's this quality that we're pointing to here.
You also, the last aspect you have, so you have this lovely tool of mindfulness equipped on your tool belt of life. You have this nonviolent communication, and this third one is somatic experiencing. Now, I had actually never heard of that before I read your book. Could you tell us what that is exactly?
Yeah, so somatic experiencing is a form of trauma healing, actually, that was developed by a man named Dr. Peter Levine. And it's a therapeutic modality that focuses on understanding the human nervous system and the role of nervous system regulation in intense events or trauma. And so it's a way of beginning to support more resilience in human beings by tracking the patterns of activation, sympathetic arousal, and deactivation, parasympathetic settling in our body, in our heart, in our mind. And so this is a form of healing that I was trained in over the last number of years, mostly initially for my own just healing and wholeness as a human being, and then it started informing my work and my teaching, because our communication patterns and habits are not just mental. They're not just thoughts. They get kind of etched into our nervous system. So our response to conflict, to difference or disagreement, or to a threat, or to intense emotions, those responses get set in our nervous system. So these patterns have a certain kind of potency and staying power to them, because it's not just a fleeting thought. There's a whole embodied response that's kind of like etched or coded in to our nervous system. So to transform and kind of craft our communication skills in a different way, we need to also be able to contact and feel the energy in our nervous system, and to learn how to work with that, to learn how to channel the activation, the intensity that gets stimulated, to learn how to calm and settle ourselves, to not get overwhelmed or flooded by the energy that comes up in these situations. So that's the relevance of that particular modality for the communication work that I do.
I see the link between that and nonviolent communication. As I studied nonviolent communication, I noticed that a lot of it actually has to do with checking in with yourself and what you're experiencing in that moment. And it sounds like somatic experiences touches on that, but it's more from a trauma perspective.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. The foundation of NVC is our self-awareness and self-connection, our ability to know what's happening for ourselves and relate to that in a wise and skillful way. And so somatic experiencing adds another dimension to that, another avenue for being aware of what's happening for ourselves and for tracking and being aware of what's happening for someone else.
You're listening to the Mindful Communication Podcast, and today we're interviewing Oren Jay Sofer. In the first half of this interview, you can get a glimpse at how mindfulness is so intertwined with communication. And this is a theme that constantly comes up with my guests. This idea that communication is not just about the words that you're saying, but it's really about the way that you're thinking. And so no wonder a practice that is revolved around watching your thoughts and watching your mind go, that communication intertwines so wonderfully. In the second half of this interview, we start to really dive into Oren's book, explore concepts that he's brought up there, and Oren provides some great pieces of advice to make all your conversations go way smoother. I want to talk about your book, Say What You Mean, A Mindful Approach to Nonviolent Communication. A wonderful read for all our listeners who are interested in learning a little bit more about how to communicate more mindfully. You divided the book into 3 parts. Absolutely loved these 3 parts. One was about leading with presence. So let's start by talking a little bit about that. Why is it so important to lead with presence in a conversation?
If we step back from conversation and communication for a moment and consider what's actually happening when we're talking to another person, we're trying to transmit some meaning, right? We want someone to understand something that we're saying, or they want us to understand something. So in order to understand anything, we need to be here first. We can't actually understand something if we're not present, if our mind is distracted or focused on something else. So the fundamental prerequisite for a meaningful or effective conversation is presence. We have to be here first to understand anything. And again, if we just consider for a few moments, how many misunderstandings, how many arguments, how many difficulties have we each known in our life simply because one person wasn't paying attention? So this is the first reason why leading with presence, starting with a sense of being really aware and present, is the first step and training in effective communication. But there are also a host of other benefits to leading with presence. When we're really here, when we're giving someone else our full attention, they can feel that. It starts to create a sense of trust and mutuality. It opens the space for us to really have an effective conversation. And vice versa, if someone's not present, if they're not actually listening or fully with us, we feel that also. We pick up on that. So just showing up, slowing down, and giving someone our full attention starts to change the conditions, the whole atmosphere of a relationship and a conversation, which opens the possibility for something different to happen.
You also, to that point, you mentioned in the book, you have this quote, the more aware we are, the more choice we have. So why is this so, and why is choice important?
Yeah, well, why is choice important? Well, we like having choice as human beings, don't we? We like to, because autonomy is important to us, and we want to be happy. So choice is important because without choice, we are simply bound to act out our habits and our unconscious desires, and therefore we have no agency or control over our happiness or sense of fulfillment in life. So awareness is the first step of having more choice and freedom. If you don't know what you're doing, you can't change what you're doing. If we're not aware, we don't have any choice. So just because we're aware doesn't mean that we can still choose. Sometimes we're aware and we're still stuck. It takes more than awareness to have choice, but there's no choice without awareness. Awareness is the first requirement for choice. It's like if you're walking down a path and you don't see that there's a fork in the road, you don't have a choice. As soon as you see that there's a branch, that there's a fork in the road, oh, I can go this way or that way. So that's the function. That's one of the benefits of awareness, is it shows us the different options. And then if the other conditions are present, to actually have wisdom, to know what's going to go in the direction we want to have enough energy and agency to shift out of our habits, then we can often make a different choice.
At the beginning of the book, you mentioned this idea that whether we've actually had formal communication training or not, a lot of us have had communication training that has been unconscious and unintentional. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's right. It's fun to talk to you, Jonathan, because you've obviously read the book, and not everyone who I do interviews with actually reads the book. So I'm just appreciating your care and time in doing that. And then I spaced out and forgot the quote you just asked me about. Say it again. Which quote was it?
The idea of the fact that we all have communication skills,
right.
But most of it has been unconscious and unintentional.
Yeah. So again, you were talking about this earlier when you said, communication is learned. So none of us know how to communicate when we come into the world. The only thing we can do is cry or smile. That's the extent of our communication skills as babies. And so we learn to make gestures and facial expressions. We learn to use words and create sentences. So communication by definition is inherited. None of us created it. It's a historical, cultural phenomenon. So it's this thing that gets implanted in our mind, the language that we use. And then together with that comes a whole lot of patterning, a whole lot of assumptions, a whole lot of messages, both in the very language that we use and the way the words and the sentences and the grammar are constructed, and then also in the underlying beliefs and messages and views that we get exposed to in our family or our culture, our religion, our society, and so forth. So all of that is learned through experience, through repetition, through investigation, through observation as we grow up. And then as we get older, hopefully at some point we recognize, all of this stuff is relative. There are other ways of looking at the world. There are other ways of connecting. There are other ways of expressing myself. I could actually start to change some of this. I could learn how to do this in a different way. And that's the beginning of our path to communication.
In the book, you have many wonderful stories from childhood all the way up to recent. And some in particular, you actually brought up a number of, it seemed like really relevant stories of issues that you've had maybe with your girlfriend at the time of you writing this book. And I want to know, as a communication practitioner, as somebody who lives and thinks and breathes communication, have you now mastered it? Are you now avoiding conflict, or are you still messing up just like the rest of us here?
Yeah, great question. I'll be 100% honest with you. I'm leaps and bounds ahead of where I used to be. I experience far less conflict in my life and much greater flexibility and freedom. And I'm human. I make mistakes. I mess up. I have arguments or piss people off sometimes, unintentionally, do or say something that's slightly unconscious. And I have my blind spots as a straight, white, heterosexual male. I have certain unconscious privilege and unconscious racism. And so, as much as I learn and try to uncover those blind spots, they're still there and they show up. And so for me, being on this path doesn't mean being perfect. It means being interested in learning and being humble enough to take responsibility when we do something unskillful or unhelpful and say, hey, I'm sorry, it's not what I meant, and I want to learn from this. So, the other thing that I see in myself is that my capacity to be non-reactive is much stronger. And this shows up particularly with loved ones, my partner, sometimes with family, where if something difficult happens, I can still be experiencing a reaction inside, but not need to act on it. To have the presence of mind and the patience to just wait and to feel it, and to go more slowly and wait until something more helpful comes out instead of just rushing with the immediate response.
I thought you were literally about to quote something from your book. I don't remember the quote, but I think it was in the idea of leading with presence. Just instead of barreling into a conversation, ready to say whatever it is that you think you're going to say, just taking some time, slowing
Right.
down and giving yourself that moment to think things through and be a little bit less reactive.
Yeah. You're pointing to this point I make about negotiating contact with other human beings, that we tend to just kind of crash into each other rather than recognizing, hey, there's another human being here with their own world, their own thoughts, their own feelings and desires, and having their own day. I don't know where they're at. And so to negotiate and navigate that sense of making contact with someone else with more care and pausing, gathering our mental and emotional resources is a great way to do that, to actually have more intentionality and deliberateness in how we relate and show up with other people.
So with this book, now it's been out for many months. What are you hoping that this book is accomplishing in the world?
Well, that's a beautiful question. I have a few different hopes for it. First and foremost, I hope that it's helping people to have more meaningful relationships and more effective conversations in their life, at home, at work, in their communities. And that seems to be happening. That's very much the feedback that I get from people, is that it really is helping them to have better relationships and better conversations, and to understand themselves better, to change their relationship with themselves. So that's one of the primary intentions. I think another intention is to raise awareness about the possibility of communicating in different ways. And there are many different forms of communication, practice, and learning. This happens to be the form that I have the most training in and have found the most benefit from. But just if people are aware that, oh, gee, I could learn about this, I can actually develop my skills in this area, that in and of itself is a great gain, because we need to be able to communicate better and collaborate and work together more today. The kinds of problems and challenges that we're facing as a species and as a society are immense, and there's no way we are able to handle them and protect the life of one another and the other creatures on the planet if we can't work together, if we can't hear each other, and not just the people we agree with, the people that we disagree with. And so my hope is that this book gives more ideas and tools and resources to people, both the people who are directly involved in that work and people who care about it but don't feel like they can engage because they don't know how yet. So as we start to learn some of these tools, we begin to have more confidence in being able to have the kinds of conversations with family members or neighbors or community members that we ordinarily wouldn't have. And that's a step in the right direction.
There's a quote that I read in your book, and I really want to ask you why you put it in and to maybe elaborate on a little bit. It's a quote from Marshall Rosenberg. And Marshall Rosenberg, he's the founder of Nonviolent Communication. And now this book is very, very well known now, over 1 million copies sold for a long time. And the quote goes, "If I use nonviolent communication to liberate people to be less depressed, to get along better with their family, but do not teach them at the same time to use their energy to rapidly transform systems in the world, then I am part of the problem." He's essentially calming people down and making them happier to live in a system as they are. So he's using NVC as a narcotic. That was shocking to read that. And I want to know why you included that in the book and what that means to you, when he said that.
Yeah. Well, the reason I put it in was just the exact response you had, is to try to help wake people up. I think that there's a tendency, and I've seen it in myself and in the circles that I move in, to use spiritual practice and all of these techniques and methods for personal growth and healing to try to make our lives more comfortable. And if we happen to have the class privilege or the economic privilege or the light skin privilege or the citizenship privilege to live in a way that we are not facing drastic suffering on a daily basis, or, where we're unable to meet our basic needs, or our children are unable to go to school or live with basic safety and sanitation, if we have the privilege to not be facing those conditions every day, it's very easy to go to sleep. It's very easy to forget that there are millions and millions of people, if not billions of people on the planet who don't enjoy or have access to those kinds of very basic supports for life. And so I put that quote right in the introduction in the beginning because it's part of my own personal mission and my own personal learning and growth to continue looking at how do I use my life in a way that doesn't just make people more comfortable, but actually addresses the vastness of suffering on the planet. And that's my deepest hope, is that these tools can help to make this planet a safer, more peaceful place.
And it's so interesting you mentioned comfort. It's so real to me, seeing around us what I like to call this inappropriate comfort, when we really want to be looking for more like an appropriate discomfort.
Yeah, that's a great phrase. It is appropriate to be uncomfortable right now.
Yeah. What is the best way for listeners to get in touch with you, Oren?
Yeah, so there are a few different ways. My website, orenjaysofer.com, has a ton of resources on it, and I invite everyone to check that out. I'm on social media at Oren Jay Sofer, and if folks want to stay in touch or learn more, the best way to do that is actually by signing up for my email newsletter, and there's a super simple way to do that right from your smartphone. You can just send a text message to the number 44222, and put one word in the text message. Put the word guided, Guided, like guided meditation. And that'll walk you through the steps to sign up for my email newsletter, and you'll get a free 6-part guided meditation series and also a short ebook that I wrote on contemplative practice.
Now, before we part ways, is there maybe one major insight you'd love to part with listeners before they go? I'm sure you have lots, but you got to pick one.
Ask yourself what's most important. Just keep asking that question, because it's easy to get caught up in the small stuff and to let the messages of our society dictate your life. And give yourself the time and the space to step back and really ask your heart, what's most important to me? And then listen. Listen closely, listen deeply, and have the courage to honor what you hear. Be willing to take a risk. Our world needs people who are listening deeply in that way and finding the courage to do something different.
I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, Oren. I'm feeling so grateful that we had this time to connect, and I'm sure our listeners benefited tremendously from so much of your wisdom. So thank you again.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Big thanks to Oren for coming onto the show. We're on a mission to create a more connected society. And one way to do that is to raise our levels of awareness around how it is that we connect and how it is that we communicate. And that's what this podcast is all about. So if you want to join us on our mission, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, with your family, social media. You can also subscribe and give it a really great rating on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get way more communication tips on Facebook at Mindful Comms, COMMS, and on Instagram at Mindful Communication. And you can also check out the website mindfulcommunication.me to see what programs we're offering there. Theme music was provided by Shinogo. You can check out Shinogo's music on SoundCloud, Spotify, Google Play, and iTunes. And editing was done by Maya Miller. Once again, my name is Jonathan Miller. Thanks for tuning in today.